Welcome to American History Lesson 26. The Cold War. Our lesson objectives are: identify the causes for the start of the Cold War, identify key actions taken by the U.S. and the Soviet Union to prepare for war, identify how the Cold War impacted American lifestyle, identify actions taken worldwide between the Cold War combatants. The Cold War begins. The Cold War was a state of hostility without direct military confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union. The formation of the United Nations (UN) in 1945, which was intended to keep peace, failed to stop the conflicts between these two superpowers. One reason for the start of the Cold War was the conflicting political and economic systems of the United States and Soviet Union. In the U.S. system of democracy and capitalism, citizens elect their political leaders and are free to buy and sell products in an open market. However, in the Soviet communist system, the leaders of the Communist Party choose the nation's leaders, and government officials decide what products are available to buy. Another reason for the outbreak of the Cold War was a disagreement over the future of Europe after World War II. The administration of President Harry S. Truman wanted strong, stable democracies in Europe to prevent totalitarianism and to provide a market to sell U.S. products. Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, on the other hand, wanted control of Eastern Europe to protect against another invasion from the West and to rebuild the Soviet Union's own economy that was damaged by the war. The Soviet Union had suffered greatly in both human life and infrastructure. Stalin was determined to rebuild the Soviet Union and make it greater than before. To achieve his goals, Stalin set up communist governments in Eastern Europe. Because these new communist countries were dominated by the Soviet Union, they were called satellite nations, as they were completely reliant on the Soviet Union. In 1946, Winston Churchill announced that Europe had been divided by an Iron Curtain into East and West, communism and capitalism. To stop further Soviet influence in Europe, the Truman administration adopted a policy of containment. Under the Truman Doctrine, the United States would send military and economic aid to any country trying to prevent a communist takeover. To rebuild Europe after the war and encourage capitalism, the Marshall Plan was created to provide billions of dollars to those nations that cooperated with U.S. economic goals. The United States formed a defensive military alliance with its European allies called the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. The members of NATO pledged that an attack on one country was an attack on all. The Cold War in Asia. After defeating the Japanese in World War II, the Chinese Nationalist Army, led by Chiang Kai-shek, fought Mao Zedong's communist forces. Despite American aid, Mao won the Civil War in 1948 and made China a communist country. Chiang and his followers fled to Taiwan, an island off China's southeast coast. At the end of World War II, Korea was divided along the 38th parallel into two separate countries, which were the Communist North and the capitalist South. When the North Korean army invaded South Korea in 1950 to unify the country, the United States called on the members of the United Nations to help. Under the command of U.S. General Douglas MacArthur, troops from 21 UN countries, about 90% of them American, fought with the South Korean army. MacArthur pushed the North Koreans toward the Chinese border, but then communist Chinese troops attacked, driving MacArthur and his troops back into South Korea. Although the fighting remained fierce, neither side gained much ground. MacArthur wanted to invade China and drop nuclear bombs, but Truman opposed this expansion of the war. When MacArthur continued to argue for his plan in the press, Truman fired him as commander. Finally, after 3 years of fighting and political pressure, the Korean War ended in a stalemate, with North and South Korea honoring the 38th parallel as the border dividing them. The Cold War at home. Many Americans felt threatened by the rise of communist governments in Europe and Asia. Some even felt that communists could threaten the U.S. government from within. Pressured by his Republican critics to do something, President Truman set up a Loyalist Review Board to investigate government employees. This board questioned more than 3 million people and removed about 200 from their jobs. In 1947, a congressional committee called the House Committee on Un-American Activities, HUAC, began an investigation of communist influence in the movie industry. Although most people brought before the committee cooperated, 10 men refused. These men, known as the Hollywood 10, felt that the committee's questions were unconstitutional and they went to prison for refusing to answer. Their careers were ruined. In 1950, over Truman's veto, Congress passed the McCarran Act that outlawed the planning of any action that might lead to the subversion or overthrow of the U.S. government. Two spy cases in the late 1940s increased fears of communism. The first involved a State Department official named Alger Hiss, who was accused of spying for the Soviet Union. In the second case, Ethel and Julius Rosenberg, members of the American Communist Party, were convicted of helping to give the Soviets information about the atomic bomb. The Rosenbergs were executed for their crime. In the early 1950s, Republican Senator Joseph McCarthy claimed that hundreds of communists had infiltrated the State Department. McCarthy never actually produced any evidence to prove his accusations, but his Republican colleagues in the Senate encouraged his bullying tactics known as McCarthyism. McCarthy's unsupported charges violated the constitutional rights of the people he accused and often ruined their careers. Then in 1954, during televised hearings into the U.S. Army, McCarthy's vicious behavior was revealed to American viewers. He lost public support and the Senate voted to condemn him. The new weapons of the Cold War. By 1953, the United States and the Soviet Union had developed both the atomic bomb and the hydrogen bomb, or H-bomb. The administration of President Dwight D. Eisenhower announced that, if necessary, it was prepared to use all its nuclear weapons against the Soviet Union. The Soviets responded by building more nuclear bombs, thus starting an arms race with the United States. Other developments increased hostilities between the two governments. In the early 1950s, the United States used the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, to interfere with some foreign governments through covert operations, or secret activities. Meanwhile, in response to the growth of NATO, the Soviets formed a military alliance with their Eastern European satellites called the Warsaw Pact. In 1956, the new head of the Soviet Communist Party, Nikita Khrushchev, crushed a growing reform movement in Hungary by sending in Soviet tanks. That same year, the Soviets threatened to launch a missile attack against British, French, and Israeli troops who had seized control of the Suez Canal, an international waterway located in Egypt. The United States and the Soviet Union fought the Cold War in the skies. The Soviets shocked the world in 1957 by launching Sputnik 1, the first unmanned artificial satellite, into orbit. American pride was disappointed not to be the first to travel into space, and money was now put into a space program to exceed the Soviet Union. In 1960, the Soviets shot down a CIA spy plane, the U-2, over its territory and captured the pilot. Although the pilot was eventually returned to the United States, the U-2 incident further damaged U.S.-Soviet relations. Fun fact, the USSR and USA were originally in talks to jointly go into space together during the Cold War. The USSR almost accepted, but then President Kennedy was assassinated, and the Soviets didn't trust Vice President Johnson, so the plan fell through. What next? Take the time to go back and review the lesson on your own. After your review, complete the lesson review for the lesson and submit for grading. Remember, your submission should follow all the rules for standard written English. All submissions must be written in your own words and sources used cited at the end. How to cite sources in APA format. When you reference a source within an APA-style paper, whether it is using a direct quote, repurposing an image, or simply referring to an idea or theory, you should insert an in-text citation. The author's surname and the date of publication within parentheses straight after a direct quote. CitationMachine.net will assist you in creating citations.